Good evening and welcome to Tea Talks, an in-depth series on the myths, truths, and untold stories of the Boston Tea Party. My name is Kelly Harangalanti and I am on the creative team here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. We are thrilled that you're joining us tonight for our first of 3 presentations with our good friend, Tea Master Bruce Richardson of Elmwood Inn Fine Teas in Danville, Kentucky. Tonight's topic is 5 teas that launched a revolution. And before I turn it over to Bruce, I'm going to give you a quick, hopefully quick, rundown of a very complex and convoluted event. So let's start off with a brief timeline to figure out how we end up at this destruction of the tea. So following the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, in 1763, British Parliament was looking for a way to raise funds to alleviate their debts. They turned to the American colonies and began enacting taxes upon them. The colonists were frustrated because they felt that if they were to pay these taxes, they should at least have a representative in Parliament to look out for their interests. So, in 1764, the first direct tax was placed on the American colonies, the Stamp Act, taxing our paper goods. Fast forward a couple years to 1767, when the Townshend Acts are put into place, taxing our paint, lead, glass, and tea. Now, in 1770, on March 5th, coincidentally, both the repeal of the Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre occurred. Though the act was repealed, they left the 3 penny per pound tax on tea in place. In 1773, early in the year, shares of the East India Company plunged on the London Stock Exchange. Boycotts and mismanagement had nearly bankrupted the company, leaving 17 million pounds of tea spilling over in London warehouses. The company also owes a debt of approximately 1.3 million pounds to the British Treasury. Now, the East India Company asked Lord North to repeal the tea duty, though he refused, claiming it would be a sign of weakness. So in May of 1773, the Tea Act was enacted. Now, under this Tea Act, the East India Company could ship tea directly to the American colonies to be sold by a select group of loyalist merchants called consignees. The Sons of Liberty protested that the funds raised by this tea tax would not help the colony, but would be used to pay the salaries of unelected officials like Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson. And it is interesting to note that 2 of these hand-picked consignees were Hutchinson's own sons. Now, these consignments were confirmed, and months later, on November 17th, 1773, news arrived from London that the tea shipments would be arriving any day. On November 28th, the Dartmouth arrived. The Eleanor would follow on December 2nd. The Brig Beaver would arrive in the harbor on December 7th, but was held out at Rainsford, or Quarantine Island, until December 15th due to a case of smallpox on board. And a bit of trivia, a 4th ship, the William, ran aground in Provincetown on December 10th and never actually made it to Boston. And so in 1773, in December, is when we find ourselves at the Boston Tea Party. And just to give you a little more context, then not much further, 1775 is the beginning of the American Revolution, and of course, in 1776, the Declaration of Independence was signed. So I'm going to go through a real quick who, what, where, why, and when of the Boston Tea Party for you. So let's start off first. Who participated in the destruction of the tea? Now, this was a very secretive event, but we estimate that about 100 to 150 men, Sons of Liberty and others, stormed down to Griffin's Wharf to destroy the tea. Many of these men were skilled tradesmen, in addition to others of prominent social standing. You might be wondering what happened during the Boston Tea Party. 340 chests of East India Company tea was destroyed in Boston Harbor. The destroyed loose-leaf tea weighed 92,616 pounds, or roughly around 46 tons. And the invoice value is, well, roughly 1.3 million British pounds, or $1.5 million in modern currency. Where did the Boston Tea Party occur? Well, it occurred in Griffin's Wharf. Now, the image that you see before you is is a map from the 1770s. And so I've gone ahead and I made a little circle there of where Griffin's Wharf is on that map. And the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum is located in the Fort Point Channel, the very same body of water where this destruction of the tea happened in 1773. And so we follow with an overlay here. So you can see Old Boston is the red outline on this map. And then Boston went through an amazing transformation, very, very interesting. So you should go ahead and look that up at some time. But then I'll do a little zoom in here on this next image, showing where this is and where we are currently. Now, when did the Boston Tea Party happen? The Boston Tea Party happened on December 16th, 1773, a very important date for all of us. The Dartmouth arrived into port on November 28th, 1773, and it then had 20 days to unload its cargo and pay the duties upon us. And the 20 days was set to expire on December 17th. So after a long day of meetings, the owner of the ships, Beaver and Dartmouth, Mr. Francis Roach, traveled down to talk with Governor Hutchinson at the request of the Sons of Liberty to send this tea back to England. But Mr. Roach returns at about 5:45 to the Old South Meeting House in the meeting of the body of the people. And he said that Governor Hutchinson would not allow this tea to be sent back. This news caused the plan for the destruction of the tea to be put into action. And this entire event lasted around 3 to 3.5 hours. Now, why did this happen? Well, there was great frustration over the East India Company's monopoly created by the Tea Act, and the Sons of Liberty especially wanted a representative in Parliament working for the interests of the American colonies. Now, Governor Hutchinson could have allowed the tea to be sent back to England, as had happened in some of the other cities, but he refused this request. You might think, how? How did they manage to destroy all of that tea? Well, the men gathered at Griffin's Wharf and were split up between the three ships. They proceeded to hoist the tea chests onto the deck, cracking them open and emptying the contents into Boston Harbor. This was all done in an orderly and swift manner. The men took care to clean up after themselves prior to departing for their homes. And of course, the following morning, they rowed out into the harbor to break up any clumps of tea and to get rid of any of the remnants of the tea chests. So let's do a quick recap, because I know that was very, very fast. So the conflict had been building between Parliament and the American colonies regarding Parliament's authority over these colonies. The Tea Act of 1773 gave new life to this debate. And under the law, the East India Company could sell tea to America at a lower price than any competitor. The cheap tea would encourage people to buy it and thus give legitimacy to the American tea duty of 3 pence per pound. Boston's Sons of Liberty feared what they saw as an East India Company monopoly, as well as another tax without their consent. They demanded that the ship's owners return the tea to England without being unloaded, but began to plan their response should government officials refuse their demands. Ultimately, customs officials and the governor claimed it was out of their authority to allow the tea to leave unless the tax was paid on it. And seeing no other option to prevent the tea from reaching colonial markets, the Boston Patriots boarded the 3 vessels and dumped the tea into Boston Harbor. Now, I know that was a lot of information in a very short amount of time, but if I've piqued your interest, I'd of course encourage you to visit our own website at bostonteapartyships.com, or pick up one of our favorite books, Defiance of the Patriots by Benjamin Carp, or The Boston Tea Party by Benjamin Laborie. But we are here to have a wonderful conversation with our friend, Mr. Bruce Richardson. So I would like to welcome him, coming to us live from Danville, Kentucky. Following Bruce's portion of the presentation, we will have a short question and answer. So feel free to use the Q&A section on your Zoom toolbar to leave questions for Bruce. So we're going to do a little switcheroo here, and Bruce is going to take over. Bruce, good to see you.
Hi, Kelly. Greetings from Kentucky.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much. Nice mug that you have there too.
I'm flying the flag tonight.
Very nice.
Well, that's terrific. Thanks for the introduction.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope our folks at home will put some questions into the box too, because I'm seeing them already. That's great. Thank you so much.
Right.
I know I have a lot of friends out there. A lot of my customers, a lot of my students are with us tonight. And thank you all for being with us. And we'll look forward to seeing you with the next two as well.
Mm-hmm.
But we were talking about chest of tea. And so I often like to explain what a chest of tea is, because even in today's tea industry, we still use the word chest, although we hardly ever pack anything in a wooden chest anymore. This is a chest from London with the initials F and M for a very famous retailer there. And that might ring a bell with some of you who've been to London, that this is from Fortnum and Mason. So in the times of the Edwardian days, when you went, let's say if you were working at Downton Abbey, then you went to Fortnum and Mason to pick up the tea, you might take your own wooden box with you, and it would open up. It was lined inside, and this would hold 7 pounds of tea. So you bring this back to put into the pantry at Downton Abbey, and then this tea would be dispensed into the tea caddies that were in the public rooms of the house. So when we talk about a chest, this is what we're talking about in modern terms, but the chest of tea that were thrown overboard in Boston Harbor, some weighed hundreds of pounds. And so they were bashed open with a hatchet or with hammers, and they were broken, and the tea was then tossed out into the water. It's interesting that I always like to tell people that it was a low tide that night, and so the tea that was spilled overboard would accumulate in big piles, almost like haystacks. And so a lot of the men had to go out in rowboats with their oars and had to beat the tea to go into the water to sink, because you see, it's just, these are leaves floating on top of water. And so it took quite a while to get them to disperse and rehydrate with the fishes there in Boston Harbor. So this is just one thing to remind you of what that tea came from when we talk about a chest of tea. So I'm going to come back with some other things to show you after my presentation, but let me go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint and show you a few things. We'll talk a little bit about more about where this tea came from, because you realize that what we're talking about tonight is 5 teas that were tossed into Boston Harbor that started this whole revolution. So this was, it's important for you to know where this tea came from. So I often ask my students to say, let's finish this sentence. All the tea in China. Yes. So if you can finish that sentence, you know now where all the tea came from that went into Boston Harbor. You also know where all the tea came from that went into Jane Austen's teacups. And Jane Austen was, she was actually born on the 2nd anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, December 16th, 1775. And she died in 1817. But in that period, she drank tea that also came from the East India warehouses in London through her favorite shop, which was the Twining shop on the Strand. And I'll show you more about that later on. And then in a few weeks, we're going to talk about the tea things of Jane Austen, so stay tuned for that as well. But now you know where all that tea came from. It was only China. And the word for tea was cha. And here you see the ideogram for cha. So this is the Mandarin name. What would be the Hindi name for cha? We know it as chai. We just add an I to the end of the word cha to make the word chai. It's interesting that, the Brits might tell you that God created tea for them when he created the world, but the tea is actually a new thing on the world horizon. So the word tea is not to be found in the Bible. Shakespeare never used the word tea. He had never heard of that word. Can you imagine what a great writer he might have been if he had had the opportunity to set one of his plays in a tea room? He could have actually become something, maybe. So there was no use of the word until the latter half of the 17th century. And by the way, it wasn't even the English who first found it from the West. It was the Dutch. And we'll talk about that as well. We had no idea what this new, where this new herb came from. We just knew that those who went to this mysterious part of the world found tea to be the drink that was ubiquitous. It was every time you would enter a home or a business, tea was served. But the thing about Western trade with China was that we could not go into the interior of the country. We could only go into the port of Canton, and you were, as a Anglo, as a Westerner, you were forbidden from going into the country. So we never saw a tea garden until the 1830s. We didn't know where tea came from. A lot of original paintings in botanical books would have what they conjectured to be a tea bush, with one tea being one bush for growing green tea and another bush for growing black tea. And I'm sure later on, some people even thought there was a bush for growing Earl Grey tea. Where does this tea come from? In China, let's look at the birthplace of tea. What we think the bush actually comes from the area around Yunnan. And so we have here today one of the largest tea growing areas of the world in the Yunnan province of China. And just across the river into northern India, you have another tea bush growing there. So in the Chinese portion of the world where they're growing tea, we call it Camellia sinensis, meaning Chinese variety. If we go across the river into the region of Assam at the top of India, right above Bangladesh, we find a bush growing there called Camellia assamica. So that is where tea originally started. The tea that went into Boston Harbor, though, let's go over here to close to modern day Shanghai. So just south of Shanghai, we had Fujian province. Fujian is known even today as one of the great tea growing areas of the world. So in Fujian province, we have two mountain regions. We have the Sunglo Mountains here, and the Bohe, or Wuyi, is what the Chinese knew it as, the Wuyi Mountains. So one of the 5 teas that was tossed overboard in Boston was called Bohe, or Buhi. So how did that word come from this area called originally the Wuyi Mountains? I think it makes a great story if you say, well, all these sailors that brought tea back from the Wuyi Mountains consumed a lot of rum on the way, and somehow after a few pints of rum, the word Wuyi became Buhi. Originally, and then became what we know now as probably Bohe. So when we talk about Bohe or Buhi, we actually mean tea from the Wuyi Mountains. And the Sunglo was famous for Singlo tea. And this was the very best of the green tea that was tossed overboard in Boston Harbor. So now you can see that even today, if you're in Shanghai and you want to head south, you can go into Fujian province and see tea growing there as well. But what a journey it had to take to get all the way back to the West. Here you see artists drawing what we think tea might have been tea production looked like at the time. And you know, as a matter of fact, it still looks like this today. I went into Taiwan, into a tea manufactory just 2 years ago, and they were still making tea exactly like this, drying it over charcoal and putting it into these baskets. And this is the way we would roast the teas 200 or 300 years ago. And even handmade teas today are made the same way. And you know, when the buyers from the Dutch East India Company came into Port of Canton to buy their teas every year, I'm sure some of the purveyors there would give them wild stories to drive up the prices. So they might even tell them, well, this tea is so expensive because we train monkeys to go up into the trees, to the upper branches, because if you leave a bush alone, it will get maybe 30, 50, 60 feet tall. And they would train monkeys to go up and pick the tea. And that's why this tea is so expensive. They even called it monkey-picked tea. And so here you have Westerners drawing of what they think monkey-picked tea might have been. It's interesting that a few years ago I had a writer write to me or call me and ask about monkey-picked tea. They were looking for to do a story about teas that men might like to drink. And for some reason they thought, well, monkey-picked, sure, a man would want to drink that, surely. I don't know what that's all about, but I told them that, no, this is not the first time that a Westerner has been caught up in this monkey-picked tea thing. We use the word monkey-picked today in the tea world just to identify the very best tea a tea maker might manufacture. So if I go to San Francisco to Roy Fong's store there and ask Roy for his monkey-picked tea, that means he's going to serve me the very best of the oolongs that he makes. That's how we use it today. Well, tea came down from the mountains from Wuyi. It had to come down on the backs of carriers like this, and usually wrapped up sometimes in bamboo. It would come down and maybe take 30 days to get down to a tributary, such as maybe the Pearl River. Here you see a Chinese, what we call a junk, holding all these teas and on its way down to the port of Canton. So most of these teas were picked in the early spring. Usually by April, at the end of April, all these teas were harvested, and then they made their way to the port of Canton, which took some time, as you can see. So by the time they got to Canton, the Western ships had made their way into the ports to pick up all their teas. And so they would arrive in November and would await the arrival of the teas, and they would be put into these huge chests and then put on board the ships to make their way halfway around the world to be consumed by Westerners. So when was tea first introduced to the West? This is a picture of a coffee shop in London. We think there were maybe at one time about 2,000 coffee shops by the end of the 1700s all across London. Now, I'll say too that even in Boston, even New York, Philadelphia, all of them had the coffee shops where men would congregate to do work and pleasure combined. As a matter of fact, in London, one of the very best known of all the coffee houses was frequented by men who were in the insurance business, and they would meet every day at Lloyd's Coffee House. And so they formed their company called Lloyd's of London in that coffee house. Here you would see only men, a woman would never be caught in a coffee house. But the coffee, chocolate, and tea all would be made in huge cauldrons in the fireplace, and then they would be served in tankards. There were no lovely teapots, those kind of things, nothing, no dainty cups. This was a man's world. Here you see the very first advertisement for tea in a London newspaper. This was 1658. I want you to remember that date, 1658, the very first advertisement for tea in a coffee house in London. And it was advertised as something that physicians recommended that you drink for your health. But how did tea get into the royal court? Well, we were just a year ago last week at Hampton Court in London with Shelley and I were with our friend Jane Pettigrew and spent an entire day at Hampton Court. And at Hampton Court, you had Catherine of Braganza come to be the Portuguese bride of Charles II. You know, the English often had to go out of the country to find people to marry them. And so Catherine was a teenager that was brought in from Portugal to be Charles II's wife, 1662. And Portugal was already drinking tea. They were getting tea from the Dutch and from Portuguese traders. So she brought her own tea with her as a young bride. And so she started drinking tea. And the East India Company wanted to give the young bride a gift. And they knew she'd like to drink tea. But they weren't importing tea at the time. So they had to go to their rivals, the Dutch East India Company, and buy some tea to give to the new Queen of England. Now, if you look at this picture of Catherine of Braganza, this picture is hanging in the governor's palace in Williamsburg. And on the end of that beautiful hall in Williamsburg today, we have a portrait of Charles II. So, you know, when Williamsburg was at its height, we actually loved the people who were reigning over us back in England. And so at that time, in the governor's palace, you had Catherine on one end and Charles II on the other, and they're still there today. Well, I call this the family portrait of the 1700s. So this is a family who is getting their portrait painted, and what do? They pull out all of their tea things. Because if someone sees your portrait and they see all these beautiful tea things, they know immediately that you are somebody who is wealthy, worldly. You know what the newest beverage is. You know what the newest thing that's arriving on the ships from the other side of the world. And you have great and impeccable manners. So here you see a family of three that is drinking their tea. And you notice that the teacups have no handles on them. And they are holding them very delicately as they drink their tea that has made its way halfway around the world and was very, very expensive. And at this time, you could only drink tea if you were very, very wealthy. All right, let's look at the very first tea consumption that we can trace to Manhattan. We think this may be the first instance of tea drinking in the colonies. And it was brought over by Peter Stuyvesant, who was the first governor of New Amsterdam, which we now know as Lower Manhattan. Peter Stuyvesant was a director of the Dutch East India Company. And when he came in 1647, we have seen his manifest, the things he brought on board the ship. And there were teapots, there were tea tables, cupboards, teaspoons. If he's going to bring all those things with him, surely he would plan ahead and bring tea with him. So in Lower Manhattan by 1647, we can pretty much say that tea was being consumed for the first time in the Americas. So how does that compare to the English? Well, remember that date I gave you about Catherine of Braganza? And then right before that was the first newspaper advertisement for tea in England. That date was 1658. Here you have 1647. So we were drinking tea in the Americas even before our British cousins were back in England. Tea was so important to the Dutch settlers of Lower Manhattan that they had their own tea wells dug just for tea water. You could even have your water delivered to your house. There were wagons with men coming around with big barrels of water that would bring it to your house, to your doorstep, and you would pay them for your water every day to make your tea. Of course, we know there were great tea gardens in England. We also had great tea gardens in New York as well. Here you see Vauxhall Garden in New York. There was a Vauxhall Garden in London as well. So tea was just as important to the early colonists of the Americas as it was to their cousins. Well, let's look, we've mentioned it already, let's look at what it has to be the most notorious corporation ever to be on the face of the earth. And that is the East India Company, which received a royal charter from Queen Elizabeth in 1600. Now, while we're mentioning the Queen, let's just remember too that she died soon after that, so she never got to drink tea. She was a big sugar consumer, so tea would have been right up her alley. But she never got to taste tea. 1600. Basically, this charter said, East India Company Board of Directors, you can send your ships on the other side of Africa, go where you want to go, raise armies if you want to, print money, govern the people, tax them however you wish, and bring back all the goods. And just as long as you give us a little bit of dividend to Parliament, you can do, we won't really bother you that much. They took this pretty seriously because this is 1600. They continued their monopoly on that part of the world up until about 1830s. So a long monopoly, and they caused a lot of trouble, shall we say, not just in the colonies, but all over the American colonies, but colonies all over the world. This is their headquarters on Leadenhall Street in London. And it was a mammoth operation they had going on there. They had so many ships bringing goods like silk and tea and spices from the other side of Africa back to London that they filled up the Thames River very quickly. So they abandoned their docks downtown and built all this area where it's now known as Docklands, the Docklands in London. And here you see that the ships are coming in to these special built docks that are just a few miles from the downtown area of London. It's interesting when you talk about the word India that people we have to remember that at that time, we had no idea what was on the other side of the world. There were no globes, no really good maps. We just knew that everything on the other side of Africa was kind of unknown to us, and so we just called it India. So you might talk about China or Japan, Korea, any of those areas of the world, and you might just lump them all together and call them India. So that's why we call it the East India Company. This is the first of the tea auctions in London starting in 1679. That auction lasted, imagine this, until 1998. What a run. So all the tea that came from China came into the Docklands, was brought into some of the warehouses down in Leadenhall Street, and then to the auction house. And here you see a picture of that going on. My friend Jane Pettigrew was at that 1998 auction. That was the last auction for the tea in London, and it was great anticipation. Everybody wanted to buy the last chest of tea that went through this historic auction house, and so it went at a great price. It was a chest of tea from Sri Lanka, and of course an English company had to end up buying it, and so they paid about £40,000 for their last chest of tea. Well, we mentioned Twinings just a minute ago, and if you've been to London, you may have made your way down the Strand from the Savoy Hotel into the banking district, and you've come across what was originally Tom's Coffee House, and it's this wee little building that now is surrounded by huge banks. You wonder how in the world this little building has continued to operate there in the shadow of these huge buildings. And so the Twinings started this as a coffee house and then started selling tea in 1706. And this is an image of the Twinings brothers there. And I spent the morning with Stephen Twining at Twinings house just a few years ago making tea. He is the 10th generation of the Twinings family to be a part of this company. Here's a short little letter from Jane Austen to her sister Cassandra from 1814, just 3 years before she died. She says, "I'm sorry to hear that there has been a rise in tea. I do not mean to pay Twining till later in the day when we may order a fresh supply." Now, Jane didn't live in London. Why would she come all the way into London to buy her tea, and especially from a place called Twinings? Well, we'll look at that later on. Here are the common teas of the colonial era. Now, these are the teas that would be found in London. These are the teas that we found in Charleston, South Carolina, Philadelphia, New York, and of course, Boston. And these, I've listed here the 5 teas that went into Boston Harbor. These were the teas that were aboard the ships. So you had our Bohea or Buhi, remember, from the Wuyi Mountains, the Kongu, and Souchong. All 3 of these were black teas. But we also had 2 green teas, Hyson and Singlo from the Sunglo Mountains. Let's look at the characteristics of all these teas. The cheapest tea on here is the very first one. It's the Bohea. It's because all the teas were, the good teas like the Hyson and Singlo were picked very, very early. Kongu was a very well-made black tea, and Souchong was a large leaf black tea. So after they picked all 4 of these teas that they could get a good price for, they realized there was still a great demand for tea in Europe. And so the Chinese growers gave in to that demand, and they went back and they just stripped a lot of the bushes to get whatever they could from them in order to make tea to satisfy the Western appetite for tea. So if most of the commoners were drinking the Bohea tea, very few of them could afford something like a Singlo. Thomas Jefferson's favorite tea was Hyson. And also George Washington's, one of his favorite teas was Hyson as well. So we have to remember that we were drinking green teas as well as black teas, both in the colonies and back in England at the time. So let's look at George III's, one of his houses in Kew Garden. This is Kew Palace that's just been restored. So I had the opportunity to go there a few years ago and do a photo shoot of some of the tea things from George III's palace. This is on his 2nd floor. Of course, George's wife, again, they had, English sometimes had to go out of country to find somebody to marry them. So they would often go to Germany. And here you have the tea things of George III and his wife, Charlotte. And you see this beautiful sitting room or drawing room where you had sewing apparatus, maybe you had a little piano forte, and then you had a tea table because, of course, the King George loved to have his tea times. So let's look closely at a few of the tea things of George III. So our camera is coming around now to the tea table, and we'll zoom in and look at what is on every tea table at during this era. Here you have on the right a kettle with hot water in it, and it was kept hot with a burner underneath it. To the left, you see a beautiful silver tea pot. So tea would be made not by the servants, it would be brought out, all the apparatus would be brought out to the table, and then you have a tea caddy there, the tall striped porcelain object, and then you had 2 beautiful teacups with these deep saucers that are all made by Royal Worcester, the oldest of the porcelain factories in Great Britain. They also made Queensware. Queensware was named for Charlotte. She was the queen when Queensware was developed. So this is all the setting for the things of George III. Let's go to Boston now, and let's look at a Boston-made tea table that is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. By the way, there's another tea table matching it, made by the same man in Winter Museum down in Delaware. But again, you see on the right, you see a beautiful kettle to heat the water. You see a teapot. You see teacups, beautiful saucers. So the colonists in America were just as much in love with tea as their British cousins, and they had their daily tea ritual. So this was one of the things that got us into trouble. Here are a couple of tea things from the Massachusetts era. So we have on the left a beautiful teapot, one of 4 we know was made by Paul Revere. And this one just sold a few years ago for $235,000. I tried to get the Boston Tea Party Ships Museum to buy it to put in their collection, but we had no luck. On the right, you see one of a pair of tea caddies that is in Salem, Massachusetts, in the Peabody Essex Museum. It's a beautiful Chinese-made tea caddy that slips into a wooden case, and on top of that wooden case is the engraving that says Souchong. Well, it's close. It needed to have a G on it, but it didn't quite make it on there. But we know that that was probably a tea caddy for black tea, the Souchong tea, one of the teas thrown overboard in Boston Harbor. Its mate has the word Hyson on top of it for the green tea. So whoever had these had a match set, because we had one caddy for black tea and another caddy for green tea. Well, what really, the straw that broke the camel's back in the world of tea in the colonies was smuggling. So the Dutch started bringing in tea on board ships that would go around the East India Company's their use of only the East India Company tea in any of the stores in Boston. So the Dutch started bringing in their own tea and going around them. So here you have a story by Richard Twining talking about smuggling and recycling tea. Because tea was so expensive, it was often recycled to put color back into it. So if you steep tea 5 or 6 times, the leaves are gonna lose some of their color. So you had this industry of taking these old teas and putting color back into them. So Richard Twining wrote this little thesis on how this was done. And here's what he said. They gather up all the leaves, and they're dried in the sun, and then they're baked, and then they're put on the floor, and then they're trodden upon, and then they are steeped in sheep's dung, after which they are dried on the floor, and then they are fit for reuse. So this was Richard Twining describing how tea was recycled. Well, I'm sure that when Jane Austen read that, she thought, oh my gosh, I'm not going to buy tea from any place else but Richard Twining's store in London. And so maybe that's why she went all the way into London to buy her tea, because she didn't want to ever drink tea that had been steeped in sheep's dung. Well, after the Boston Tea Party, a lot of the women and men too swore off tea, George III's tea in Boston, and they turned to their orchards and to their gardens to use anything they could that would make colored water in their teapots. And so they would call their teapots now their Liberty Teapot, and they started making Liberty teas. In one of our future broadcasts, we're going to talk about some of those. Well, by 1773, the company became too big to fail. You know, they were being undersold by the Dutch. They had this huge fleet of ships bringing in tea from Canton into their warehouses in London, and their warehouses were filling up, and they weren't emptying as fast as they were filling up, so they were overflowing with tea, and it was getting to be 3, 4, or 5 years old. And so the East India Company went to the Parliament and said, look, if you don't do something about this, we're going to fail. And if we fail, the banks will fail. And if the banks fail, the whole government is going to fail. We are literally too big to fail. That's why you had then Parliament act upon this huge amount of tea that was going bad in the warehouses of London. So basically, they said, well, let's have a garage sale. Let's get that tea out, send it over to Boston, Charleston, New York, Philadelphia, and we'll set it all up so we can eliminate all the pressure on the East India Company. Well, of course, Kelly's already told you what happened from then. So we threw all that tea overboard into the river in Boston on December 16th, 1773. And aboard those 3 ships that made it, the 4th ship, of course, you heard, got wrecked. And aboard that ship was also the new street lights for the city of Boston. So they went down in the drink as well, along with all that tea. So we had 240 chests of bohea black tea. So what does that tell you? It tells you that cheap tea was coming to Boston. So that was the majority of the tea. It was the cheap black tea. 60 chests of Singlo green tea, which is one of the most expensive teas. 15 chests of Hyson, 15 chests of well-made Kongu black tea, and 10 chests of Souchong black tea. So that was what went down into the drink that night. Here you see is the total invoice for all those destroyed teas. And this, by the way, is still in a museum in London. We have yet to pay it. So, you know, it's, and I doubt that it's ever going to be paid at this point. What do you think?
Yeah, probably not.
I don't think so either. So we've talked about, you know, we often talk about the Boston Tea Party, but now you realize it wasn't just Boston. It was also happening in Philadelphia. Tea was turned back in New York. Tea was turned back in 4 different cities in the colonies. Well, about a year after the Boston Tea Party, you know what the consequence was of the Boston Tea Party? It was that the ports of Salem and Boston were closed. People were literally dying from starvation in New England. It was desperate times. So the people of North Carolina decided they would do something. So the little town of Edenton on the coast of North Carolina raised funds and put together a whole shipload of supplies that snuck into the port of Salem in order to feed the families of that part of the world. It was, one of the organizers was a young woman named Penelope Barker. And Penelope Barker was so distraught about what was happening that she organized a tea party for 50 of her female friends in October of 1774. Then they got together and they signed a letter to King George that basically said, "Dear King George, we are no longer, the women of Edenton are no longer going to buy any fabric, any tea, or any needles, anything that comes from you that we have to pay tax on. And we are boldly signing our names to the bottom of this letter." And that's what those women did. Now, contrast this with what happened back in Boston is all the men who went on board the ship in Boston never let anybody else know that they were on there. They also often they were in disguise because they knew this was an act of treason, and if they were caught, it would be off with their heads. But you have 50 women in North Carolina to boldly put their names on this letter to the king in defiance of his taxes. And this is the first instance of a women organized political party or organization in defiance in the Americas, and it happened in 1774 in North Carolina. Now, the interesting thing about this story, it gets a little better. It's because she had a husband who was a lawyer who was stationed in London at Hampton Court as the solicitor representing the Carolinas to Hampton Court. So here this letter arrives at Hampton Court from Edenton, North Carolina, bearing the address of Penelope Barker. And in this letter says, you know, King George, fooey on you. And she never told her husband she was going to do this. And so this letter arrives. He has to flee for his life. Otherwise, he'll be put into the brig. So off he goes to France, and he had to stay there until the war was over. So Penelope Barker did a great thing. She just should have told her husband she was going to do it before she did it. And the English press loved this story, and so they made all these caricatures of her and the women of Edenton, making fun of them in the press there in London. Well, we come to the end by talking about what happened after the revolution ended. So shortly after the end of the revolution, you have in February 22nd, 1784, a ship leaving the port of New York, and it is bound for Canton. It's loaded with every bit of ginseng that could be accumulated in New England because the Chinese loved ginseng. So off it goes to Canton, but it's bearing a new flag that the Chinese have never seen before. And when it arrives at Port of Canton, they can't quite figure out who the ship belongs to. But soon they realize this is the country that has vanquished the British. And of course, they're all for that. And so they're welcomed into the Port of Canton, they're great parties. And so this was the very first trade mission from the United States of America to China in 1784, bearing ginseng. And guess what they traded the ginseng for? Tea. So tea was brought back, the very first commodity to be brought back from China by an American ship, 1784. So we've come a long way, haven't we, in the world of tea. So just a few wrap-ups to remember that China was the origin of all tea in the West until the mid-1800s. There was no tea in Sri Lanka, no tea in India, no tea in Japan. Well, there was tea in Japan, but we couldn't get it out. And that there were both green and black teas exported from China. 1647, probably the first tea in the Americas, and it was by the Dutch in Lower Manhattan. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston were all devoted to tea. We all had our tea ritual, and we weren't going to give it up. And the East India Company was the only official supplier of teas into the American colonies at that time. So if you can remember those things, you may be the life of the party next time that we can all get together again, or if you ever play Trivial Pursuit again, you know some great answers. So I'm going to turn it back to Boston now, and let's have some questions from you.
All right. Great, Bruce. Thank you so much. You're such a wealth of knowledge where tea is concerned. You know, it's so great to talk to you. Yeah, so if you have any questions, go ahead and throw those into the Q&A bar there at the bottom. So yeah, let's see here. What have we got? All right, so I have a question from Wendy, who says, was there no security on the ships protecting their assets?
Well, you know, the holds were all locked up. And the captains of the ships were scared to death that the ships were going to be burned. And there were no guns involved by any of the men who went on board. The captains were so afraid of their ships being burned, they immediately gave the keys over to the rebellion in order to save their ships. And within 2.5 hours, you know, it was all over with. But the British had also pulled away. So everything on board the ships had been taken off except for the tea. And so it was guarded for weeks by the local patriots, but there were no British that we know that were guarding it there that night, which was probably a good thing. There was a TV show that came out a few years ago that was happening at this time, and they did a portrayal of the Boston Tea Party, and it was not very accurate. But let me just say this, because I did see some guns being flashed every now and then.
Yeah, no, we were pretty lucky. I think because of, you know, what had happened with the Boston Massacre, they were afraid to have any more skirmishes going on. So yeah, great question, Wendy. Thank you for that. Allison would like to know, she says, in Boston, was tea drinking an activity reserved for the elites, or was it an activity accessible to all levels of society?
Well, originally it was just the elites, because only the elites could afford this commodity. There's a great story that comes from, I don't know if it's true or not, but I like to tell it. It comes from Salem, that a man who lived in Salem brought home to his family a packet of tea that he had bought at the harbor off a ship, and he was so excited to get this because this was the newest thing. And he brought it home, and except there were no instructions on it. It was just wrapped up in paper. And so his wife said, well, how do you make it? He said, I don't know. I just know you put it in boiling water. So she had a big cauldron of water going in the fireplace there in Salem. And she just took this big packet of tea and dumped it into the cauldron. And she watched the tea leaves all rehydrate and expand, and the water turned different colors. So she pulled, after about half an hour, she took the cauldron out into the yard and dumped all the liquor into the yard. And then she took it back into the house and took all these hydrated tea leaves and put them on a big ironstone platter and put butter and salt and pepper on them and served them for dinner that night. So just say this: a little instruction goes a long way if you're going to make tea properly. She missed that course somehow along the way. We forget how exotic it was. You know, this was the newest thing from the other side of the world. We had no idea how, what to do with it.
Absolutely. All right. So, one of the biggest myths, I think, of the Tea Party is that the tea was not in loose leaf form like we've discussed, but that it actually comes in tea bricks. So I bet you have one sitting there. Yeah. Look at that.
Yeah, this is, tea bricks have been around for centuries. And I call this the American Express card of China, because you never left home without one 200 or 300 years ago, because this is what you took to trade. If you were traveling across to Mongolia or to Tibet, you would take a tea brick with you in order to buy your food, have safe passage wherever you wanted to go. This compressed brick of tea was very common in China, still is today, but it never came out of the Port of Canton into the West in any great amount. It would go on the backs of camels or horses north across Mongolia, across the steppes into Russia, or into Tibet. It would sometimes be wrapped up in a log like this and covered with bamboo. And these would be placed on the backs, large models of this, we placed on the backs of camels, would go across the Silk Road, because this was indestructible. You couldn't hurt it. It could fall off a horse into the river. They'd pick it up, dry it off, and take it on. But can you imagine Jane Austen taking a tea brick and breaking up the tea and putting it in her beautiful Regency tea caddy? Absolutely not.
No.
So, and these, by the way, would not have sunk into Boston Harbor. They would still be floating out there today. So, no. If anybody tells you that brick tea was thrown into Boston Harbor, you say, I don't think so.
So speaking of things, still floating around, I guess this question might really be for me. Is it true that there is only one known surviving tea chest from the Boston Tea Party?
Ooh, a good question. Yeah.
So that is a great question, right? And the truth is yes. And we are the lucky owners of that tea chest. It is called the Robinson Tea Chest. It was found by a young 15-year-old boy named John Robinson. But I'm not going to go ahead and spoil the story right now. I will encourage all of our viewers to tune back in with us on Tea Talks in October, when my colleague Josiah George will go into the history of and the very interesting lineage of how this tea chest was passed through families for years and years. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, we're so lucky to own that tea chest. It's really, it's so nice.
It's a great piece of American history.
Oh,
you almost
so
want to
beautiful.
weep when you see it.
Right. Yeah. Yes. And, when we were closed for several months, when we came back, it was one of those things that was like, oh, there it is. Like, we get to look at it again. So that was pretty great. I think
we also might mention too that this wasn't always called a tea party. The word tea party was only an invention of a writer from Cincinnati in the 1800s, because all these men slipped off into the night and they never spoke of it. There was no list of all the people who did this until much later. So one of these men died in Cincinnati in the 1800s, and when his obituary was written, they mentioned that he was part of the famous Boston Tea Party, and that was the first printed reference to the word tea party. It was a rebellion.
That's right.
Originally.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I think we have time maybe for one or two more here. So let's see. Did Bostonians change over from tea to coffee because of the Boston Tea Party?
You know, I get that question a lot, but that's why I put in that last slide talking about what was the very first thing that Americans bought when they went to China. It was tea. So tea was still very important, but the culture slowly changed, and so we were still drinking tea, but not quite as much. And the reason that England continued to be such great tea drinkers, and still today, is because of the East India Company. They were feeding this appetite for tea, and then also craftsmen across the country were making tea tables, tea caddies, porcelain was popping up everywhere, and so you had all the accoutrements to go with it. So you were building this ritual of tea that continued on through the 1800s and even today. So that's why they have continued to be great tea drinkers. It's all because of the East India Company. They built that tea empire.
Yeah, they did.
And it continues.
Yeah. All right. And so how about one more? So Connie is asking us for comparable teas today and maybe some characteristics of these teas that would, you know, perhaps mimic these 5 teas that we talked about tonight.
Well, I often say that if these teas were presented to you today, you would not drink them because they would be so bad. So okay. You had to realize, especially bohea. I mean, that was just, they went into the gardens and just stripped everything that was left to make this, to make colored water. And I often say that maybe that's the reason that the British put so much milk and sugar into their tea, just anything they could do to make it taste better.
Yeah.
So all those teas would be almost undrinkable today. But we do have, this was one of my assignments when I first began to work for the Boston Tea Party Ships Museum, was to come up with replicas of these teas today. So we source teas for the Abigail's Tea Room and for the museum from the same regions that where the original teas came from. But of course the names have changed, the way they make teas have changed over the years, and so actually our teas are better. One of the better black teas is this is a Kongu black tea. The word Kongu is like the word kung fu in martial arts. It means a discipline. So if I say this is a Kongu tea or a kung fu tea, means this is a tea that was made with great discipline. It's a well-made, well-crafted tea. So that's why it helped you remember that this was the better of the black teas tossed overboard. And this tea is quite delicious. And when you go to the Boston Tea Party Ships Museum, in Abigail's Tea Room, you have all 5 of those teas set out there, and you can do your own tea tasting and taste what these teas might have looked like, might have smelled like, and might have tasted like, except ours are better. So you'll get the tea.
Yes, your teas, Bruce, are very, very popular. We are extremely lucky to have the tea tasting here. So yeah, anybody that's in the Boston area, we would encourage you to come by. You know, of course, there are some restrictions with COVID-19, including wearing your mask, using hand sanitizer, social distancing, and all that. But you can still enjoy the 5 teas that were tossed overboard at the Boston Tea Party. So, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been great. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again. I just have a couple more slides here for us to look at. But throughout Bruce's presentation, he was mentioning his friend Jane Pettigrew. And let's see here. There we go. And so Bruce and Jane wrote a great book together called A Social History of Tea. It is an amazing book. It fills in, you know, a lot of the things that Bruce was talking about this evening, but a lot more and a lot of great images and everything. So I would encourage you to pick that up. We have some copies available at shop.bostonteapartyships.com, and we would encourage you to take a look at that. Of course, checking out Bruce and the Elmwood Inn Fine Teas at their website, elmwoodinn.com, and his various social media channels. And visiting us at the Boston Tea Party at our website and our various social media channels. We have all kinds of things going on there. And we are still extremely lucky. We get Bruce 2 more times this month. So next Wednesday night at 7 o'clock, Bruce and I will be back with the Birth of Liberty Teas. He gave us a little teaser earlier tonight, but we'll get to talk about those together. And then on Saturday, the 19th at 2 o'clock, we're going to do a little matinee show about the tea things of Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. So that'll be a lot of fun, I'm sure. And I did mention before, in October, our next topic is going to be about the Robinson Tea Chest. You can see some images there. If you are in the Boston area, we would encourage you to come by. Even with our new restrictions and guidelines here, our new tour experience still includes a chance to look at the Robinson Tea Chest. So we are very lucky to be able to still show that off to everybody. But everyone, thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to send them through the website. But we hope that you'll join us next Wednesday night for the Birth of Liberty Teas. Thank you and good night.
Bye.
Bye, Bruce. Thank you.